Are you a prepper or homesteader looking to connect with like-minded people in your area? Looking to start your own preparedness group? Already have a group? Well, look no further than PrepperNet. PrepperNet is dedicated to personal responsibility, individual freedoms, and being self-reliant. PrepperNet has monthly meetings in over 100 cities where you can meet and learn with like-minded people in your area. PrepperNet, where preppers unite. Find us online at preppernet.com.
Survive, thrive, stay alive. It's time to get prepared with the Prepping Academy podcast.
Hello everyone, this is Patrick, in for the Prepping Academy today. We're going to pick up with a multi-part series, beginning with a discussion on communications system failures and infrastructure failures during Hurricane Helene. We've all heard lots of things so far about the hurricane, about the recovery, and about everything else, but today we're going to do a deep dive in how we ended up in the communications situation that we ended up in after the hurricane struck western North Carolina and many other areas. So first, we're going to look at some critical infrastructure failures and take a deep dive into kind of what happened and how we ended up in a situation where there was no power, no cell phone service, no internet, pretty much no nothing for the better part of several weeks. And there are still many places that still do not have power and internet service. One of the things that everyone already knows at this point, I think, and if you don't, well, now you do, many roads were destroyed, including bridges over Interstate 26 and sections of Interstate 40 through what we call the Gorge between Tennessee and North Carolina, both of which were damaged by the Pigeon River or the Nolichucky River. One of the things that most people do not consider when they think about roads, and we drive roads every day, it's how we get everywhere. It's also, if you look to your left or your right as you're driving down a road, you probably see telephone or utility poles with power lines and cable TV and telephone lines and fiber optics for internet and all of those things following roads. When many of these roads flooded, washed away, slid down the hillside, collapsed, bridges got washed out, etc., so did the utilities that followed them. So we ended up in a situation of losing power, losing fiber optics for communications, and even in many cases losing other buried utilities such as water systems, sewage systems, natural gas. Many of those were also damaged during the mudslides. So compared to a normal hurricane, where we get storm surge flooding, comes in from the ocean, causes a lot of damage, and then goes back out, the force and rage with which the rivers flowed out of the mountains took with it everything from the landscape, stripping it down to bare rock in many places. In days and weeks following a normal hurricane on the coast, utilities get repaired, things get fixed, telephone poles get put back up, and things go a little more back to normal. This was delayed not only because of difficulty accessing many of these locations due to road damage, but also because there was simply nothing left to repair. There were many miles of buried and above-ground utilities that were completely wiped from the face of the earth. Nothing to repair. Total complete rebuild from the ground up. And this is causing the recovery on that front to drag on much, much, much longer than many normal, if there is any such thing as a normal, hurricanes. We don't normally see a hurricane in the mountains. We certainly don't see rivers that are almost flooding receive an additional 20 plus, almost 30 inches of rain that causes this scale of flooding and this scale of destruction and damage. Normally, when cell phone services fail during a hurricane, they typically fail from one of three causes. Cause one, and the most common cause, is a loss of power. When the power goes out, the cell site doesn't work. Now, cell sites should have backup power, either in the form of batteries and or generators. that will keep them running for a set period of time. We'll dive a little more into that in a second. The other cause of failure is transport damage. And transport is the fiber that connects the cell site back to the rest of the communications network. Typically, we see some damage to that, but nothing on the scale of what has been seen in western North Carolina. And then the third cause of damage is actual physical damage to the infrastructure on the tower or the tower itself. And this one is the more rare of the three. During Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of damage to stuff on towers due to the high sustained wind speeds. In North Carolina, there was not as much of that, but there were also structures that were damaged and equipment that was damaged by flooding and mudslides, landslides. So we have a combination of issues bringing about why no one's cell phone worked, why everything just went dark. Now, if you want to learn a little more about the actual statistics and the information that goes into this, and we're going to take a pretty brief look at this, but there's tons and tons and tons of data available from the FCC. If you search for FCC DIRS, that's the Disaster Information Reporting System, or DIRS, you can find the reports for every major emergency, every major disaster, where the FCC activates the system and requests that carriers and broadcasters and all telecommunications companies report their outages so the FCC can track them, and so everyone can be aware of kind of what the communications situation is in the area and potentially allocate resources to try to improve that situation. Now, documentation for Helene is pretty massive compared to your normal hurricane that impacts a couple of states, because there's a lot of states that were included in this activation, but we're going to primarily look at North Carolina because that's where the interesting things happen. And as I'm kind of scrolling through the data here, if we look at Buncombe County, where Asheville is located, there are 348 cell towers in that county. At the peak of the incident, around 215, or 61% of them, were not working. And it breaks it further down into the three reasons. So in Asheville, none of them were out due to physical damage. 89 of them were out due to transport, or that fiber optic backhaul. That's a huge number compared to what we normally see. 117 were out due to power, and 26 of them were on, but they were running on emergency power. Now let's talk about emergency power for just a second. Typically, emergency power can be batteries that last up to 8 hours. That's why oftentimes after a particularly weather event where a lot of power systems are damaged, you'll see cell services after 8 hours, sometimes less. The batteries don't always get replaced when they should be. Will start dropping offline as the batteries go dead. A lot of those sites were designed to give the company 8 hours or so to grab a generator. There are literally companies that specialize in renting generators to telecommunications providers when a natural disaster happens, so they can take those and hook them up to their sites. Very common practice, happens every year during hurricane season, and that would be the fix. If we've got 8 hours, we get in there, we get it on backup power, and it's all good. And that saves them from having to put a generator at every site, maintain fuel, maintenance, all those associated costs. The problem here was many of these sites weren't accessible. You couldn't tow a generator to them and plug it in. There was no road to do that with. That's one issue. Now, if we kind of look down through here a little further and we look to some of the counties that were actually harder hit, potentially even, if we look at like Avery County. Avery County only has 21 cell sites in the entire county, and 52% of those, or 11 sites, were offline, so about half of them. I imagine that Avery County on a normal day has only marginal cell service to begin with only 21 sites, but 50% of those, 52% of those were out, 1 due to damage, 4 due to transport, and 2 due to power, which, interestingly enough, doesn't add up to the total of 11 that are supposed to be out, but somebody probably didn't submit why that theirs were out, just that they were offline. So as we look at this, we see a lot of this is damage to transport. Another, as I look down through here, Henderson County. Henderson County has 158 cell sites. 116 of them, or 73% of these cell sites, were offline. 42 of them were off due to transport, 61 due to power, 1 due to damage. So as we kind of scroll through here and look at different ones that kind of stand out of the reports, Rutherford County had 23 out due to transport of its 35, or 37% out. Transylvania County. Yes, there's a Transylvania County in North Carolina. If you're not from North Carolina or near North Carolina, sometimes people go, wait, what? Anyway, yes, there's a Transylvania County in North Carolina. So 70% of their cell sites were out. They only had 30 to begin with. 70% of them were out. 13 of them were out due to transport. 8 were out due to power.
Hey, let's take a quick break.
Are you a prepper or homesteader looking to connect with like-minded people in your area? Looking to start your own preparedness group? Already have a group? Well, look no further than PrepperNet. PrepperNet is dedicated to personal responsibility, individual freedoms, and being self-reliant. PrepperNet has monthly meetings in over 100 cities where you can meet and learn with like-minded people in your area. PrepperNet, where preppers unite. Find us online at preppernet.com.
And then the other one that's really kind of standing out here to me, or a couple, there's 2 more that I'll mention real quick before we move on. Mitchell County, lots of folks know kind of what was going on in Mitchell County, has 20 cell sites, 18 of them were down. 90% of their cell sites were not working. And 11 of those were due to transport, 7 were due to power. Another one was Yancey County. In Yancey County, they have 22 cell sites. 20 of them were offline. That's 90.91% offline. 11 of them due to transport, 9 due to power. If we take a look at the total for North Carolina in the affected area of the activation, there were 1,452 cell sites in the area. 707 of them were off due to some reason. That's 48% of the cell sites across the entire affected area were down. 3 got physical damage. 303 of them had loss of transport or the fiber optic backhaul. 338 had no power, and 102 were running on emergency power. So those are kind of the numbers, and those are not normal numbers for a hurricane. Normally, the transport damage is a lot lower. And kind of as an example of that, we'll look at the Helene hurricane damage results for a state that was not in the mountains. So if we take a look at Georgia, in Georgia, Burke County has 60 cell sites. 20 of them were offline. That's 33%. Were offline. Of those, 5 of them had transport damage, and the rest were power. We see when we get out of the mountains and look at locations that a lot had no power. Columbia, Georgia, 195 cell sites, 87 out, or 44% of them not working. Of that, 18 of them had transport damage, 59 did not have power. Outside of the mountains, we see power outage. Power's easy to fix. Most of it's above ground. Poles get stood back up. The lines get put back up, and we're back good to go. The transport is typically buried. Sometimes it's above ground in rural areas, but a lot of times it's buried. It's fiber, and in this case, it was all completely destroyed, and will take months, if not years, to reconstruct to some of the remote areas that cell sites are in. I know of one carrier that is microwaving some of their data out of western North Carolina because that's the easiest way for them to get that information out with the damage to the fiber networks. That's the thing to consider when we look at how different things affect and how we prepare for communications emergency. Cell sites are fragile, normally due to power, and they're normally restored quickly because it's power. When fiber and the communications portion is damaged, particularly in the case of buried cables being washed away or destroyed by landslides, this stuff takes a long time to repair, almost as though we were in a war zone and it was destroyed due to bombings or those sorts of things. We see that protracted recovery where that things aren't going to be back. That is how Western North Carolina, in particular, ended up in the situation of nobody had cell service anywhere, and the few that did had very poor service due to system overloads and those sorts of things. But we found that communications were down for a significant portion of the time. It is over a far more protracted time than we would typically see during many emergencies. North Carolina and South Carolina had very high numbers, so did Georgia, of affected users in the area. Another interesting thing related to this, as I look, there's another section of the Disaster Information Reporting Service that has to do with broadcast. And in North Carolina, there were 2 TV stations off the air that were impacted by this. There were 3 FM stations out of service and 2 AM stations out of service at the time of the information I'm looking at here. It says in Tennessee, there were no AM or FM stations off the air. And that's not true. There was 1 AM in Irwin that was completely underwater. That's because not necessarily all the information gets reported into this. It's a voluntary system, particularly for broadcast. For some people, it is mandatory. Reporting in the information here, sometimes it's actually worse than what we see. This is just the information that we have in general. As we look, and I'm kind of down a rabbit trail here, and I'm probably getting boring. I don't want to bore everybody. But as we see, there's a huge amount of issues with communications that come up from a variety of these things, especially in the sort of situation we saw with the hurricane, which is not a normal disaster by any means. What can you do about that? And where did we see alternatives that come into that? Amateur radio really shined in Western North Carolina kind of as a hero to connect communities, to help coordinate disaster relief, and to do a lot of really amazing things. And a lot of that came through the repeater that is located on Mount Mitchell, which is owned by N2GE, that's November 2 Golf Echo. And that repeater covers almost from my house in East Tennessee all the way over into the middle of North Carolina. It's on the highest peak this side of the Mississippi. And it's an incredible repeater with incredible performance and an incredible footprint. And it was used continuously after the hurricane for just so much work, from trying to locate missing family members to coordinating emergency food drops, to disseminating information and resources and coordinating. And it just incredible situation of amateur radio in that environment. We also saw cases of communities that were coordinating using simplex radio-to-radio via amateur radio, or groups within communities that were coordinating doing that. A lot of repeaters were not on the air. They were down due to lost power. They were down due to damage. They were down due to a lot of things. But there were a few repeaters on the air, and most notably the Mount Mitchell repeater, which is located on Mount Mitchell at a site that receives a very large amount of attention due to the FM station that's up there and due to the fact that it is a federal primary entry point for EAS. So that's one of the important things to consider when you're communications planning, when you're making those plans, is what do you know about the repeater that you're made to be depending on during an emergency? What kind of backup power does it have? Is it going to receive attention and refuel and resupply? Because things run out of fuel, especially in a protracted emergency like this. And Western North Carolina was extremely blessed that this repeater was located somewhere that was going to receive all of this. Even if it had to come by helicopter, it was going to receive all of this because it was up there with other critical infrastructure. And that kept it going and kept people communicating. As we look at that, was such a blessing. Something I want you to keep in the back of your head that we're probably going to talk about a lot more later is imagine what the situation in Western North Carolina would have been like if that repeater hadn't been there, or if that repeater had been offline due to damage. And instead of it being a relatively, and I'm doing air quotes here, simple way to communicate with VHF and UHF radios, either handhelds or mobiles, and that had gone from that to the only way you were communicating in and out of some of the rugged terrain there was via HF radio, which is a lot more involved. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind that they were very lucky, and not everybody's going to be that way. So you need to have, that PACE plan, that primary, that alternate, that contingency. You need to have a plan B in case that repeater is not available. One of the things I want to talk a little bit about here while we're talking about amateur radio is I want to talk about some examples of radio failures, because there was a lot of amazing and great stuff done on amateur radio. We also saw people that had some issues with amateur radio while they were trying to use it. And oftentimes in the preparedness community, we'll get I don't need to get a license. I can use my radio during an emergency. That's true. This was a prime example of that. In fact, there were a lot of people who ended up on the repeater getting help that didn't have a license. And there were a lot of people who probably needed to get on the repeater and needed help that didn't have a license and couldn't make their gear work. So having that license lets you learn how to use the stuff, lets you test your gear, and lets you verify that you're able to use it during an emergency. A lot of people who were using them during an emergency that maybe didn't have a license in some circumstances were using radios that had been programmed or had been handed to them by someone who was already a licensed amateur and had done that side of the work for them. Giving on Amazon or eBay or wherever, buying a bow thing, as is the common prepping thing, it doesn't really help you if you don't know how to program it, if you don't know that works from where you are. So one of the things I want to talk about with that is radio programming. There are some people who will try to market to you, hey, I'll program your radios for you, you pay me, I'll send you a kit ready to go. And that's great, except for the fact they don't live where you are. They don't know anything about the radio situation in your area. They don't know anything about that infrastructure. They're just grabbing that stuff off the internet, where you could go do the same, sticking it in a radio and sending it to you, but that doesn't tell you anything about it. You don't know anything about the culture and the people that are on that particular frequency. You don't know anything about the emergency power situation. You don't know anything about the local political situations surrounding that repeater. You don't know anything about that. You've just got this and you're hoping it works during an emergency. The other thing is, oftentimes things change quickly during an emergency, and you need to be able to quickly adapt. And if you don't know how to adjust and make changes, you may find that what you have doesn't work because something changed during an emergency, and now you're not able to use the resource. An example of this would be something, every manufacturer has a different name for this. It could be privacy, it could be PL. But anyway, there is something we use in the radio communications world, not just amateur and commercial, everywhere, where we use tones to control the receiver of the repeater. And if the receiver needs to receive a signal that has not only a signal, but also has the proper tone in order to unlock the repeater and make it transmit. Well, in the amateur world, many of us want our repeaters to operate in what is called carrier squelch, where there is no tone required, where it repeats any signal it receives on that frequency, because that's the most friendly way to do it. Makes it very easy for anybody to just punch it in the radio and use it, because that's the spirit of amateur radio. It's a very open, inclusive environment when it comes to that sort of thing, though at times we do have to use tones generally to mitigate interference. And a lot of repeaters will have the ability to turn the tone off and on remotely. So many of us that want to leave that off, leave it off, but if something happens and there's interference because of something, whatever that something is, that's tying up the repeater with noise all the time, we'll turn the tone on to deal with that problem. Well, if your radio was programmed by someone else and they didn't know about that and they didn't program the tone, well, now all of a sudden you can't get into the repeater and you don't know how to program the tone, even if the net control that's on the air is saying, hey, the repeater tone is 103.5 hertz. Please put 103.5 hertz tone in your radio. Get back with us here. You need to make sure you know how to do that and aren't dependent upon someone else that you can't pick up the phone and call. You can't hop on the internet and look it up. You need to know how to do that. One of those things that just happens and it changes on the fly, and interference is far more likely to pop up during an emergency than it is during day-to-day situations, because a lot of new equipment is on the scene. There's a lot of people operating equipment that wouldn't be operated on a day-to-day basis. So the likelihood of there being some sort of harmful interference that requires a tone to keep the repeater working properly increases as a lot of outside resources start pouring into the area. That's one of the issues that pop up with failures. A lot of people, Mount Mitchell stayed carrier squelch the entire time. This was never a problem. But I've seen in other areas when there's a situation somebody has to turn a tone on to mitigate a problem, all of a sudden there's a bunch of people that start having problems. That's something you need to know how to do. Fortunately, North Carolina, that really wasn't an issue, at least with Mount Mitchell, but something that's important to know. Another thing that a lot of people who purchase radios and don't have a license, don't know, haven't invested into the learning all the things about radio, is deviation. Now, we're not going to get into the mechanics of frequency modulation and how deviation works. That's above the scope of what we're going to do here. But the thing to remember, deviation has to do with how wide the modulation is in FM, which in FM equates to volume, how loud that you are, perceivably are, is the better way to put that. And one of the things that we saw is in the amateur world, most amateur repeaters are running what we would call wideband audio. In your radio, it's going to be the wide setting for deviation. And there were a lot of people that didn't know anything about that, and a lot of bow things default to narrow deviation, which is what's used in the family radio service and in most in pretty much all commercial applications. And because of that, if you're transmitting narrow band into a system that's designed for wideband, you sound really quiet. And if you're already on a handheld with a marginal signal in the noise, you may not be audible above the noise, or you may be hard to pull out of the noise. And I heard that on the Mount Mitchell repeater at least once, where somebody had their radio with the deviation set incorrectly, and the net control was kind of saying, I really hope this person doesn't have an emergency. Try to check your radio settings and try again, but we can't hear you out of the noise. Understanding and making sure your radio is configured correctly for the application that you're using is extremely important. Most amateur radio equipment kind of figures that out for you. If you're using like Yaesu or ICOM or Kenwood, it kind of knows because it knows how the amateur bands work, and that's kind of built into the firmware. When you start using commercial radios, and I'm going to very loosely lump Baofengs into commercial radios because they function on that front more like a commercial radio than an amateur radio. It depends on the user to know a little more in order to make sure all those settings are right. It doesn't make assumptions for you. Understanding those sorts of things and making sure your gear works. If that person had a license and had been on the repeater, before the event, somebody would have said, hey man, your audio is really low. You need to check your radio settings, make sure your mic gain is set correctly, and make sure your deviation is set correctly. That's one of the reasons why you kind of need to learn this stuff beforehand. The other thing that is important related to that is a lot of people, I won't say a lot of people, maybe a lot of people, I don't know. A lot of people in the prepping world I've met, well, I can chunk the repeater, so if I need to, I can get into it. That's not true. Just because you can manage to get the repeater to key by pushing the transmit button on your radio for a second and not talking, doesn't mean that you're going to be understandable on the other side of that, either because of audio quality issues or because you just don't have enough signal to actually be readable through the repeater. You may just have enough signal to get it to drop into transmit and then drop out, and it may just pass noise. So again, having that license, being able to transmit, being able to talk to people will tell you that, hey, I'm able to communicate from here, really communicate from here, not just assume I can communicate from here. So again, one of those things you need, this is a perishable skill. It is something that you have to practice. It's something you have to test your gear constantly. It's something you have to work on frequently. Otherwise, it won't be there when you need it. Another thing that I really want to talk about related to amateur radio before we move on to some other radio services here within the hurricane is antenna damage. So you've all heard the saying, 1 is none and 2 is 1. Well, that goes doubly so for antennas, especially outside antennas. Most people that had outside antennas got their antennas smashed, either by the wind, falling trees, etc. If you depend on an outside antenna for being able to communicate with VHF and UHF to the repeater, make sure you've got a spare that will get the job done. I mean, it could be something as simple as a copper J-pole or an Ed Fong roll-up J-pole and a piece of PVC pipe or whatever. But you need some extra antennas and you need extra coax. So if a tree smashes your tower and your antenna, you can get back on the air in an emergency. Because there were a number of hams that were off the air temporarily or for a little bit longer because their antennas were damaged. And that goes double for HF antennas. If you're not a ham radio operator, you're probably not familiar with HF antennas. HF is much lower in frequency. They're much longer antennas, typically made out of wire. An 80-meter antenna is 134 feet long, typically strung up between some trees. So during a storm, those sorts of things have tree limbs fall on them, they get broken, they land on the ground. You need to know how to repair those, or you need to have a spare, preferably both. So in an emergency like this, where maybe you can't get out and get parts, maybe you're cut off for days or weeks, you can go and fix your antennas, get back on the air, and communicate, because you might be the only person that can communicate out of your community. I remember early on in this event, and I'm going to go down a little bit of a rabbit trail here and tell a story about one of my friends in Western North Carolina. Early on in this event, we didn't know what was going on. I'll maybe do a little bit of a podcast and walk through the timeline of the first about 10 days of this. But for the first 4 or 5 days, there were a lot of questions. In the first 48 hours, all the attention was on Asheville, Swannanoa, and some areas of East Tennessee up in Unicoi and Greene County, because those areas had some form, some level of communication, and a lot of people there to get some information out about what was going on. So all the attention was going there. But at one point, they were looking for amateur radio operators in Avery and Mitchell and Watauga and some of the other counties that were up in the Tow and Cane River watersheds, up where, we heard things like Little Switzerland and Spruce Pine and a lot of these communities that are now kind of household names for people that are nearby that they didn't even know existed before, because nobody had heard anything. It had been 48 hours and the roads were blocked. There was no way to get to these places. No one knew if there was anyone even alive. And that was a huge, huge, huge communications and information for those of us who are who like intelligence, kind of as a side thing. There was no information to build an intelligence picture about those areas. There was this massive black hole in northwestern North Carolina that nobody had any idea if anybody still existed because you couldn't get to it. They were flying helicopters over. They were trying to get a picture of what was going on, but there was little information available out of there. And there were people on the radio asking, has anyone made contact with any radio operators in, these areas? And they were getting no response. And that's because most of the operators were off the air. They weren't prepared. Their antennas were damaged. They had no power, whatever. And they weren't able to be that voice for their community to get information in and out during this time of need. And that's one of the things that we have to consider as, those of us who are communicators in an emergency. You see it in the movies, you see it in the TV shows. Everybody during the whatever emergency goes knocking on the crazy ham radio guy's door going, hey, can you communicate for us? And that's based off of a little bit of reality, because I think everybody realizes those people that have the ability to sit here for fun and talk to people 400, 500, 600 across the ocean, thousands and tens and thousands of miles away for fun, that fun can be turned into a truly valuable, indispensable resource when you don't have any other way to get information. Now, to pull this back on course here, one of the things that became very apparent to me when I was talking to a friend of mine that lives in, we'll say, central western North Carolina, kind of near Fletcher area, for folks that are familiar with that, down I-26. They had no cell service. They had a lot of trees down. They had some damage. Compared to a lot of places north of them, they had nothing. It was very mild. But they didn't have power, and they didn't have cell service, and they didn't have that for a while. I'd have to find out for sure, but it was at least a week. And some of them I had kind of been checking on a little bit, but it wasn't until the third day when PrepperNet did its HF digital net on Sunday night, and we passed a piece of traffic that was kind of just a summary of what we knew about the affected areas, that this particular friend of mine realized that he wasn't in the worst hit area, and that this was much bigger than just what he saw from his perspective. And now looking back on that, hindsight, what we knew on day 3 there was really not all that bad compared to what was in some areas. We knew about, obviously, Swannanoa and Asheville and the I-40 through the gorge that was destroyed, and I-26 and those sorts of things at that time. We knew about all that stuff. They didn't know about that, and that was valuable information to them. But later we found out that it was even worse. And that information vacuum, when you're inside of that space, is a huge thing. You don't know how big the disaster is. You don't know how long help is going to be. You don't know so many things. And having that link to the outside world is so critical to know how to respond, to know how to prepare, and kind of know how to manage the situation. Because that first 24, 48, even in this case, 72, 96 hours, people were still trying to get a picture of what was going on because the communication situation was that bad. And it could very easily be that bad in a lot of other emergencies as well. Something to consider, something to plan around. And how would you build this? How would your group, how would your community, and how can you support and build those networks now with people even out of state? I was out of the impacted area, but right on the edge. Within about an hour drive or less to some areas that were just totally destroyed. And I was able to sit there and collect information, use the internet, source and combine and try to help people through that using these grid-down communications methods. So those are things that we have to consider as we look at communicating, and how are we going to benefit our communities, our families, and be a help for that. Because as preppers, as people in the preparedness space, this is the kind of stuff we're really going to do. Sure, there's an outside chance that we all, see the Panamanian paratroopers parachuting in, and we see some sort of Red Dawn type scenario. Sure, there's a really remote chance of that happening. But there's going to be times, potentially more frequently, as we see more extreme weather and we see a lot of other things, and we're going to go down the rabbit trails and maybe why some of that's happening. But there's going to be a lot of times where that people need help, and the things they need are food, water, communications, shelter. They need those things, and those are the skills that we're going to actually use to benefit our fellow man and to and to serve the Father. Another thing that we saw that I wanted to touch on kind of here in episode 1 is the family radio service, the bubble pack radios that you get at Walmart. Everybody was using the family radio service. I did some work with Grindstone Ministries that was working out of East Tennessee. One of the things we were seeing some of and that we were hearing from other groups coming in, and I was hearing through my own sources and channels, a lot of communities were asking, hey, can you send us FRS radios because we need a way to coordinate within our community. And with cell phones being down, people didn't have a way to just conduct basic business and communications. So people everywhere were using family radio service. Family radio service was in every neighborhood. Parents were going and digging through the house and finding their kids' bubble pack radios they got 5 years ago for Christmas, putting batteries in them, and they were using them to, talk to the people down the street and help coordinate cleanup and just do what they could to build some form of semblance of normalcy. If you don't have your license and you're just thinking about your community and your neighborhood, hop on the internet and go buy yourself, and you can get decent ones for cheap. Get the 2-watt radios that are a little newer design because they work a lot better than the old 0.5-watt FRS radios from when I was a kid. But get some good FRS radios. You can get them for less than $20 a unit usually, and put back 10 of those and use those to communicate in your community if you need to. I've set up several neighborhood watches, community emergency response groups using that kind of radio to communicate in their neighborhood. And it works because the first step of that communication is communicate in your neighborhood. If somebody in your neighborhood or a couple people are ham radio operators, then you can communicate from the FRS people to the ham radio operators and then communicate out to the rest of the world and coordinate supply drops, coordinate medevac, CASEVAC, whatever it is that you need to do in that particular environment and situation. So family radio service really was a hero. I didn't hear really anybody on the multi-use radio service, MURS. A lot of preppers kind of gravitate towards MURS because there's not many people on it and they want the privacy. And that's great. If that's your goal, that's a good radio service for you. It's also got a few other benefits we won't go into here, but it's not common. In fact, it's really uncommon. That doesn't make it a good choice for a disaster where everybody's trying to interop and coordinate. That's one of those things that we kind of have to balance as preppers. We often get wrapped up in the privacy, OPSEC. But in a disaster, it's about, I need to communicate with everybody. So what's my method of doing that? The things that we have to balance and figure out and plan for what's likely and what we need. And now would be a great time if you have a neighborhood that's got some like-minded folks in it. You have a community that's got some like-minded folks in it. Get everybody to buy some FRS radios. Stick a sign up on the bulletin board or in the entryway to the subdivision. Emergency Radio Net, FRS Channel 5, Thursday nights at 8 p.m., whatever. And just get people to communicate that way a little bit. And then if something happens, they've got the gear, they're practiced with it, and they're ready to go. Last, on that front, there's some other radio services really not going to talk about. Those are the ones that we saw doing the lion's share of the work. There's one that I have a question about, and that's the CB radio, the CB radio service. I didn't see anyone using CB during my time in the impacted area. If anybody out there knows of people who are using CB to communicate that didn't use CB every day already, I know there's a subset of people that use CB all the time, but if you know of somebody that when the cell networks went down in Western North Carolina, that grabbed a CB radio, threw an antenna up, and got on the air and used the CB to communicate. Drop me a line and let me know. You can reach me at knoxready, that's KNOX ready, at protonmail.com. Send me a note, tell me the story. I'd love to hear about it. Just to see if CB's still out there doing stuff, because it's got its pluses and it's got its minuses. I mean, I heard stations during a band opening on CB the other day from across the country. It doesn't happen every day. Doesn't actually happen every year. It happens once every solar cycle or two. I'm just curious as to whether or not CB actually saw any use during that. I know of several emergency management folks that keep CBs in their trucks because they think that CB will be used a lot during an emergency. So I'm just curious on that front and what was actually going on, because I did not see that. Last one of the things I want to bring up with this as we talk about these sorts of things is power. Obviously, the power went out, and you need to have a plan to charge your stuff when the power goes out. All of your communications gear uses batteries or needs power. So you need to have gasoline generator, the right chargers, the right cables, the right everything to make that work. Batteries, same thing. You need to have batteries to run your radios off of. Solar is a great solution for radio because radios are very low power draw unless they're transmitting devices that draw a very small amount of power over a large period of time. That makes them very conducive to running off batteries. So make sure you have a way to recharge those. Even though for the first few days after the hurricane, it was very overcast and there wasn't much sun. So have enough to do that for several days, or the ability to recharge from your generator. But have a power plan, because communications and logistics go hand in hand. It is very, very hard to effectively logistic if you can't communicate. And it's very hard to get the resources, the assets, the people where they need to be if you can't effectively communicate. And I'm not saying that people during Hurricane Helene did not communicate effectively with the tools they had. They did. They did a great job with what they had. There were a lot of people that did amazing, amazing work, but there's also better and more efficient ways to do some of the things that needed to be done if you want to train on that and you want to get a group of people together to train on that in your community. So don't forget that there's always room for improvement, but overall, we have a situation here. We're going to look at it. And people did what they could with what they had. And we will see that over and over again as other disasters happen, as other events happen. People figure out, improvise, adapt, overcome, and come up with a solution. As a prepper, prepare to integrate into those systems and prepare to support those systems. We talk about FRS. Don't forget GMRS. It's $35 for a license, covers your family, and it allows you to use more powerful radios with external antennas, and you can communicate with FRS users as well. So it's a great way to extend the range of those FRS radios and those FRS users in your community. If you have a external antenna that's 50 feet in the air and a mobile radio or a mobile setup as a base radio attached to that, that's going to make you able to talk much, much further to people with their handheld FRS radios and them talk back to you than you would be able to with just a regular FRS radio. So there are tricks, little things you can do to improve your footprint and your coverage. And during an emergency, you can figure out ways to make that to improve your fighting position, as they say. Improve that position every day. Do something to make it a little better. And don't depend on other people's infrastructure, even if it's repeaters. And I know they're more robust than the cellular networks. But have a plan if none of that stuff works and you literally are on your own. I talk from Eastern Tennessee to Western North Carolina very regularly using HF radio. The only thing between me and my friends over there is a piece of wire and a radio. So no infrastructure needed. Gaining that independence, that's what we're about. Self-sufficiency and independence. Learn that stuff. I'm working on some online classes to help people who want to learn more about communications. Hopefully I'll be talking more about that in the future. If that's something you're interested in, you want to up your communications game, and you want to get that plan together. We'll be talking more about some of that stuff here on the Prepping Academy podcast as well. As always, I would like to encourage you, if you are not a member of PrepperNet, to go to www.preppernet.com to check out and learn more about PrepperNet. And if you want to join in the social media and the conversation, go to www.preppernet.net and sign up. It's free to sign up. You have access to different city groups as well as all of the national discussion. We have a section in there that is completely dedicated to communications if you want to learn more about communications. But there's also sections on disaster preparedness, severe weather, food canning, homesteading, you name it, it's in there, and there's people that love to do it and are good at it. If you want to learn more, I encourage you to go there, check out preppernet.net. And at this point, I'm going to wrap up today's show. Thank you for listening to the Prepping Academy podcast and listening to me ramble on here for nearly an hour. I hope everyone had a great holiday season, Merry Christmas, and a wonderful New Year as we get 2025 off to an interesting weather start as well as just an interesting global start here. It's going to be an exciting year, and we look forward to being with you throughout this year here at the Prepping Academy. Next episode up, we are going to talk about a little more in depth what we did during the early days of the hurricane to do communications operations and support some of our friends, family, and PrepperNet community, and talk a little more in depth about the timeline of how that things came to light for us who were outside of this, and kind of how you can benefit on that. That being said, everyone have a wonderful week, and we will look forward to talking to you again. This is Patrick in for the Prepping Academy podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Prepping Academy podcast. Preppers Unite at www.preppingacademy.com.
Has your data been hacked? Do you feel uneasy about the vulnerability of your personal information online? Were you involved in the Target, LinkedIn, or Microsoft data leaks? Don't know? If not, then pay attention. Join Forrest Garvin from PrepperNet for a free webinar on privacy and security. Gain insights into safe internet browsing, VPNs, crafting online aliases, secure emails, detecting if your data has been hacked, and managing passwords. Secure your spot today for this webinar on privacy and security. It's free. This webinar delves into comprehensive strategies for bolstering your online privacy. We've got you covered, from fortifying your passwords to shielding your financial information and mastering state-of-the-art encryption techniques. We're offering 2 convenient dates to suit your schedule. Reserve your spot now at preppernet.com/privacy. Don't let cyber threats erode your peace of mind any longer. Take the first step toward a safer, more secure online experience by joining us for our free webinar. Remember, knowledge is power when it comes to safeguarding your privacy. Sign up now at preppernet.com/privacy. We'll see you there.